down for their own ice cream sundaes or something. I hope that's the case.
They heard you before.
Yeah, they heard. So I won't talk about kitchen jazz because they're not here. But even though they're not here, I will talk about the children. We've only, where is Joe? I think we only really have about 6 children in the stockade, 3 of whom are helping us here today. Sarah and Charles and Samuel. And then Owen came, and whether we get the twins or not, I don't know. But, you know, in a residential area like this, with houses packed next to each other, was what people went away from when they could have backyards and things that stockade really doesn't have, lots of grass. So anyway, I think so is that right? We only have 6 children. Yours, 2 twins, and the 3 that are helping today.
I think so.
I think that's right. And a kind of a paucity of children. What I'm going to tell you about is how this book came to be. I really did start it 60 years ago. I'm going to talk about its contents a little, and then I'll tell you how I made it, or how it got made, because it was a new experience for me, one I'd never had, and I think for a lot of other people as well. Anyway, it did start 60 years ago when I had graduated from MIT and had spent 2 years in the Army, and I was offered a job in the President's office at MIT. So I left Fort Riley, Kansas, and Denver, and all my early life to go back to Cambridge to work at MIT. So what the story really is about how I went from being a very green, inexperienced, and wide-eyed country boy in Denver. I want to make sure this is working as best it can. Being a wide-eyed country boy from Denver to being president of the senior class in my MIT class in 1952. And I went from there. The book started really as a story. I had thought that was such a wonderful experience that I would describe it as a story, because we had some interesting events. We had one student threatened his roommate with a gun. We had another situation where the dean of residence for the college.
Bob, can I stop you?
Sure.
People would like to hear you, but I think they need to move into the room a little
Okay,
bit.
let's turn up.
I don't think we can hear you out here.
Sure, can we
I don't
turn
know
up?
if it needs to be
Can we
more
turn up the
amplified.
volume?
Can we just have everybody move in a little bit here? You've got the air conditioning on. Somebody said it was hot. I don't know. I've been running around, so I don't know if it is or not. I can hear it.
There's another seat here, if you don't mind sitting that close to the speaker. You can be my right hand, Lydia. I'm flattered that so many of you have come.
We're not ready yet. There's still people wanting to hear you. And so, Ian wants a front row seat. Here he comes, right?
Right here.
We've got Rose Cooper coming. Wait a second.
Yep.
Because if they miss it,
There's
they're
room
not
here,
going to
too.
hear it again.
One more chair here.
I'm going to do this again at 5:30, so.
Brings it on seat.
Hello, Rose. Yeah, Rose comes prepared.
You want a little help in that? No. And Jeanette wants to hear every word that comes from your mouth.
Well, almost every word.
I can sit on the floor.
You can sit on the arm of the couch too. It's.
Here's another chair. Let me bring a chair. Would you like to sit here?
Sit down.
Where? Sit here.
No.
The job of being student body president at MIT in 1952 had its issues, but when I'm talking about how the book came to be, I'll talk about content in a few minutes. But how the book came to be is at first I thought of it as a story, because I'd really had a nice time, I had a nice experience, and I thought it would be something that would be useful for anybody interested in undergraduate life at college and what it was like to be a member of a fraternity and stuff like that. After a while, though, I got bored with that. It was not MIT taught you a lot of things, but they didn't teach you much about writing. And I decided after a while that I really should aim something at my two grandchildren, my grandson, whose father is taking his pictures, and my granddaughter, wherever she is, and her daughter, who is both of them are elsewhere today. And as you all know, or almost all of you know, these children find new ways to, new lives of their own. So you don't always get them involved the way you'd hoped to. But anyway, so the book went from being a story 60 years ago to 30 years ago to becoming something I thought would be something, I'd hand down a photocopied copy. And after having that experience and the ones that followed it, I began to decide maybe I really should aim for something a little more ambitious. So, as I will describe when I talk about the company that I've worked with to publish it, I am now trying to decide the extent to which I want to promote it. The company that I work with creates space as a whole menu, a Chinese menu of options for promoting your book as well as everything else and making your book. And I can spend $100 and get it sent on mailing lists, a description of it sent on mailing lists, or $5,000 and hold book signings all over the country and shot on the Today Show or whatever. I don't know what I would offer it, but by and large, that doesn't interest me very much. So a little about the contents is, to summarize that, I'm waiting to decide. I'm working on deciding how to promote it. I set for today, and calling these advanced copies, a $10 price. I expect, and I'd be interested in anybody's reactions to this, I expect to ultimately to charge $14.95, but we'll come back to that. So the book really is broken into 4 different sections. I'll read you the titles of them. I promised to read a little. That is, if I could find it. It's right here. The first section is on crossing Harvard Bridge. I don't know how many of you know Cambridge, but Cambridge is across the Charles River from Boston. MIT is just across the Charles River from Boston on the Cambridge side. Because Harvard was there 150 years earlier, the bridge got named Harvard Bridge. And the MIT students have ever since been angry and tried to get the name changed from the Harvard Bridge to the MIT Bridge, so far unsuccessfully. Anyway, I had lived in a fraternity, and the job of being student body president required me to be on campus. So I was given a room in the MIT dormitories and spent my senior year in the dormitories. And as senior class president, I had, as I mentioned, 2 or 3 interesting issues. A classmate, a year younger than me actually, another student who threatened his roommate with a gun with a lot of excitement that night and the few following days. We had a dean, a very close friend of mine, and in fact the man whose wife and him encouraged me to write the book. And the big event in my undergraduate life was we were in the midst of the McCarthy era, and Senator McCarthy accused of MIT mathematician of being advocating the overthrow of the government, being a communist and advocating the overthrow of the government. And it came to student government just the way, because this is the way MIT works, it came to student government to decide what are we going to let this, how are we going to treat this issue. There was a group of students that wanted to raise money and get support and have a big institute-wide meeting to get all the people that wanted to support their communist professor, who was actually a lovely man, to support their communist professor and raise money for his defense. So the second chapter talks about my job, my year as student body president, including that incident. After 2 years in the Army, and I was invited, as I mentioned, back to work in the president's office at MIT. I think they looked on me in part as somebody that could maintain student contact with the president's office, which sometimes got a little bit out of touch with the undergraduates. And so it brings up another memory. They looked to me, I think, in part to help maintain student contact. But I did have a business background, and so they put me on this committee and that, and I got to draw up an elaborate organizational chart of MIT. It's all lines and squares and boxes. I'm sure you know what an organization chart looks like. MIT was a crazy one. After 3 years of that job, I decided I really wanted to move on. I had seen myself as becoming some kind of a research administrator, the kind of guy that helps do things, say, at the GE R&D Center or wherever. And I was about to leave. I was about to leave when Jim Gillian, who was the president of MIT at the time, and my immediate boss, or my second boss, his first assistant was my real boss. Anyway, he invited the two of us, his first and second assistants, to come listen to a television broadcast that evening in his studio. So we did. And to our utmost surprise, President Eisenhower identified him by name and said, because of the preoccupation with Sputnik, the country was in an uproar over the Soviet satellite. They didn't know what it was. They were afraid of it. They were afraid they'd get shot. People could look at them from space. People didn't understand what a satellite was. So Eisenhower was speaking to the American people, and he identified my boss as his new science advisor in Washington. So Jim Gillian took the job as science advisor to President Eisenhower. Coincidentally, just about the same time that I decided to leave the MIT president's office and the work that I was doing. So I talked with him briefly, and he said, "Would you like to go to Washington?" Well, you know, you're not going to pass an opportunity like that up. So my then 2-year-old son, my wife, and I moved to Georgetown, and I became assistant to the science advisor to President Eisenhower. The science advice was provided primarily by something called the President's Science Advisory Committee. And a who's who list of who is science in America was on that committee. The director of research at IBM, the director of research at GE, the president of the Bell Labs, and on and on. And including the president of Polaroid Corporation, who also lived in Cambridge. After 11 months for me, 18 months for Gillian, he left Washington to go back to MIT as president, and I decided to leave Washington. I knew at the time, because I'd met him on this committee, I knew the president of Polaroid, I knew they did research. He was in many ways considered a kind of a modern folk hero, like Steve Jobs was considered a folk hero, supposedly brilliant, etc. He had invented the Polaroid instant camera, and so instead of waiting a week to get a photograph back in the event, the people that you took pictures of had long since dispersed, he made it possible to get the photograph in a minute. So I asked him, do you need a research administrator? That was my image of what I was going to be. He said, well, come to Cambridge and let's talk. So I did, and talked with Meroy Morse, M-E-R-O-E, Morse. Meroy Morse was the daughter of a Princeton mathematician, a famous man, and a brilliant woman in her own right. In many ways, she was his research, chief of his research. but she hated budgets, and she hated personnel work, and she hated space work. And so she was delighted to find some cookie that could come along and do that stuff for her. And here I was dreaming of doing exactly that kind of work. So it really worked out very well. So I worked 4.5 years for Polaroid. Thomas Alva Edison described, this is one of the conundrums in my recollection of this process. Thomas Alva Edison described a genius as 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Well, Land was a master at getting people to work for him, an absolute master. He was adored. He was a very wealthy man. He was considered a folk hero. Steve Jobs, who met him twice, called him an American treasure. President Eisenhower gave him a Presidential Medal of Honor. He was a towering figure in the 50s. So anyway, I was in a world as the administrator of his laboratories where people loved to work for him. And as I say in the book, though not quite this clearly, it was a mixed blessing in some ways. I was accused of running a harem, and I'm not convinced I wasn't. He did not have, he had one man with a PhD who was a very modest chemist, and about 8 or 10 very attractive young women, and then a number of technicians and a manager or two of the group of technicians. And so when they moved Polaroid film from 6-second development to 10, he would have a big fury of activity. He would involve many of these people into late nights of work, and then start again the next day. This would keep up for 2 weeks until the product went on the market, and the solution was solved. I did that for 4 years, and so the conundrum that I mentioned is, to what extent is a genius dependent entirely upon the inspiration? If he's 99% perspiration, and this guy could get the perspiration on his behalf anyway, and I think probably was involved very much with it as a young man. If he provides the 99% perspiration, is he still a genius? It can't be one without the other, really. I left Polaroid when I was, after 4.5 years, which is a chapter in my book, and finished it up with an epilogue about the things that happened to me after I left Polaroid. During that time, Ansel Adams was a consultant to Polaroid, and so I worked with Ansel, and I have a couple of his photographs in the other room. Land himself had an office that wasn't much bigger than this room, but books on all 4 sides, and John, and outside interest, and 2 doors, one to his laboratories and one to his front office. He was very proud of the fact that he was president, chief executive, chairman of the board, chairman of the board, president, and director of research. And he would tell you, director of research is the only one that's important. And in fact, I think that's the only one he did well. But that was something that was just a byword of working for Polaroid. So I quit that after 4 years. I add a little bit of an epilogue of things that have happened to me after that. And really don't talk much about skin or sex or any of that. There is some of those things in the book, but you can't avoid some of them. At Arthur's one night, Moon and River, one night I was talking with a young man, I don't know his name, was talking about publishing a book, and he had done it. And he said, well, contact Create Space, they'll do it for you. Well, that was an adventure for me. I'm sure most of you, or many of you, know more about publishing now than I did. But it used to be that you'd come up with a manuscript and you'd send it into somebody and they'd say, we like it or you don't like it. And they would make their decision based on how many they could sell. If they could sell 10,000, I think the rule of thumb is that they could do it. Because you gotta design it, you gotta design the interior, you gotta proofread it, you gotta do all the jazz of bringing it to life, and then you gotta promote it. Well, this company, Create Space, and there are others in this instant publishing business, can print one of them. I can order one now, or I can order 10,000, and they'll print them in response to the order. And as I was saying earlier, Create Space, which is Amazon.com, Amazon company. Create Space has a whole Chinese menu of options. You can get your cover designed, you can get your interior design, you can pick your typeface, you can decide what you want it to be, you can get a proofread, you can get an editorial evaluation so that you're not saying is when you should say are, and things like that. And you can promote it at the end. You decide things like what's in it, what title you give it, how much you charge, and they have at least 6 different channels of distribution, and you get a different royalty for each of the 6 channels of distribution. One being Amazon.com, and one being a Kindle e-reader, and one being a European outlet that will distribute it widely throughout Europe, one English outlet, and 2 more that I've forgotten. And each one of them, the difference between them is that if I charge $14.95 for the book, I would get a certain amount of royalty if I go this way, a certain amount if I go that way, a certain amount if I go that way, and it could be as different as 3 to 1 in terms of your reward. But the point is, I think you can take them all if you're willing to take the lower return from say the European distribution. Is you don't get much money if they sell a book in Europe. You do pretty well if you sell one on Amazon.com. So where I am now, it's gone from being a story to being a thing for my children to being something I've wondered might have some other value. They also have available a service. One of the menu items is a service called Kirkus. Some of you have probably heard of this. They will promise you an objective assessment of your production. They say, be aware that if they don't like it, they're going to tell you. And you can't ask who wrote that critical stuff. You can't ask for another one hoping for 2 out of 3. This is it. You get a professional review of your book, some criticism of what you've said, and some checking of some of your facts, and then you can do whatever you want with it. You can quote them if you like what they say, or you don't have to. You can throw the whole thing away and hope you sold one to your mother, and go on from there. So that's where I am at the moment. So that's the story of my book. I'm getting it evaluated. And once it's evaluated, I intend to decide, how serious do I get about selling it? So thank you all very much for coming. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I bet your mother's very proud of you.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
When will the critique be done?
Another 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
We need to contact Bill Buell at the Gazette since they are so interested in this thing. I think they really like it.
Well, we actually invited Bill Buell to come here with his wife Sarah, but we didn't hear back, so we'll follow that up.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to talk about that you're going to sign your book in the other
Oh,
room,
yeah.
too?
As I said, the book, the price I intend to ultimately charge is $14.95. But today, given the fact that it's an advanced copy, I'd be thrilled to sell anybody a copy for $10. So I'll be signing them in the other room, and I've got plenty of them to sell, believe me.
Yeah, what? Plenty of them to sell.
So again, thank you very much.